Good morning and welcome today to a current conversation that is happening in the Russian Federation. Today we welcome not only the Russian Federation, but everywhere around the world. And today we welcome Mr. Franz Sedelmayer and Dr. Frederick H, who are experts on the topic that we're going to be discussing today. During this session, feel free to ask questions in the Facebook comments window. If time permits, I will address the select few. As a way of introduction, Mr. Franz Sedelmayer is a German security consultant and CEO of the US-based multinational asset recovery company. He attempts, through legal proceedings in various jurisdictions, to win compensation for assets expropriated by the Russian states in the 1990s, have been covered by the world media. The Sedelmayer versus Russian Federation saga, which included approximately 80 different legal proceedings throughout the world, is an illustration of the difficulties one might encounter when trying to enforce investments arbitrarily against a state, arbitrary award against a state. We were very honored back in spring of 2018 to welcome Mr. Sedelmayer at Utah Valley University, and he presented his excerpts from his memoir, Welcome to Putingrad, highlighting the case he won against President Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation. Mr. Franz Sedelmayer today will offer his perspective on Putin's answer to the Navalny problem. Alexei Navalny returned to Russia this January after recuperating in Germany from being poisoned with a suspected nerve agent. The Kremlin has denied involvement. Navalny, one of Putin's most prominent critics, has recently been jailed for parole violations and is now in a corrective penal colony about 60 miles east of Moscow. Mr. Sedelmayer has also joined in this conversation Dr. Frederick H. White. He is a UVU professor and author, multiple publications on Russian, but he's a professor of integrated studies on Russian at Utah Valley University, and currently is teaching a course on Russian political structures with a focus on Putin's rise to power, and will co-present the event today with Mr. Sedelmayer. Gentlemen, good morning to us. Good afternoon, Mr. Sedelmayer. He's currently, I believe, in Tennessee. That's what you indicated. It is good to have you with us, and we're looking forward to your perceptions and your opinions in regards to what is taking place currently in the Russian Federation in regards to the Navalny's case. Welcome, Mr. Sedelmayer. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning from Virginia, not Tennessee. Anyway, thank you very much for having me today. I was going to talk a little bit about Alexei Navalny. He is a man who openly challenged Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin establishment, and just recently has become the head of Russia's now unified opposition, which is something that never happened before. He was endorsed by nearly everyone active inside Russia and also in exile to work for regime change against Mr. Putin. This activity eventually got him poisoned with Novichok, a chemical substance banned under international law. He did survive, recovered in Germany, decided to go back to the motherland, and as a result of it, now resides in a Russian prison colony. Navalny means many things to many people. Inter alia, some weeks ago, Amnesty International declared him not to be a prisoner of conscience. He has also been described as a politician, a brawler, a convict, a nationalist, a xenophobe, an entrepreneur, human rights activist, investigator, reporter, anti-corruption campaigner, influencer, and also a candidate for the Duma, which is Russia's parliament, for the Moscow mayor, and the presidency of the Russian Federation. So what is the man's background? He is a generation that has seen great changes and was only a child when communism came to an end. Alexei Navalny was 13 years old when the Berlin Wall came down. He's 15 when the USSR breaks apart into 15 independent states. He's 21 and still a student when he founds his first of his many commercial enterprises. He obtains his law degree at age 22 and specializes in finance and security law. At age 31, Yabloko, which was Russia's most important democratic center-left party, actually founded by the people who privatized the USSR leftover industry, expels Navalny for its so-called national activities, which damaged the reputation of the party, so he said. The same year, he establishes an alt-right, populist, anti-migration, xenophobic nationalist party platform called the People's Movement. Age 32, he supports Putin's war against the Republic of Georgia, taking control over South Ossetia. He calls for missile strikes against the Georgian general staff and for blowing all planes out of the sky that enter the disputed airspace. He calls the Georgians rodents. He becomes an Aeroflot board member at age 36, albeit occupies that post for only 7 months when he's confronting corruption in that partially state-owned airline. At age 35, he's being arrested for the first time, organizing an anti-Putin demonstration, and is incarcerated for 15 days for resisting the police. Pre-2021, he has spent some 450 days under arrest for similar offenses in dozens of other cases. He announces to run for the presidency in 2013 at age 37 and coins the popular meme, the party of crooks and thieves, when talking about Putin's United Russia Party. The same year, Navalny and his brother are sentenced for defrauding a commercial company, a verdict declared void by the European Court of Human Rights. The tribunal finds the verdict served only one purpose: to keep Mr. Navalny from running for the presidency. By the way, this is the case that now is still active in Russia that landed Mr. Navalny in the prison colony where he resides right now. Russia is a member of the European Charter of Human Rights. They actually have to accept those judgments, but as a matter of fact, they chose to ignore that. By rights, Mr. Navalny should not be in prison today. He investigates Rosneft, Surgutneftegas, Gazprom, VTB Bank, and TNK BP, and shows how graft among the largest state-owned companies works and who benefits from it. Age 38, he supports Putin's annexation of Crimea. 1 year later, Navalny organizes mass protests around Russia, criticizing a corrupt Kremlin establishment. He starts investigation into the personal wealth of Vladimir Putin, the former president and prime minister Dmitry Medvedev, and the prosecutor general Chaika. His investigation reports become a YouTube sensation and haunt the establishment in Russia until this very day. As you can see from his history, Navalny is not perfect by any means, but he seems to have since learned from past blunders and has distanced himself from his alt-right positions, trying, just like Mr. Putin, to draw from Russian radical nationalism, which, so Navalny believed in the day, was supported by some 60% of the Russian population. He now enjoys the unequivocal support by all the Russian opposition inside and outside of Russia, from exiles like Michael Khodorkovsky or Garry Kasparov, but also by Pussy Riot, Albert Akunin, and many others active inside Russia. The ultimate goal for everyone is a change of regime, reforming the presidential system in Russia to something that may be more acceptable for the population. And that means a parliamentary democracy with all checks and balances, reducing the absolute power of the president's office in the Russian Federation by representing the parliament and the people through a prime minister who will handle the daily affairs. Now, let's talk about Mr. Putin's stance to Mr. Navalny. I don't think anybody would be surprised to learn Mr. Putin is not exactly a fan of Mr. Navalny. As a matter of fact, his activities have caused the Kremlin headache. And the headache comes actually from the problem that many in the establishment actually are very corrupt. And Mr. Navalny took it up on himself to uncover this corruption. He was filming, live streaming the wonderful estates that Russian politicians have built for themselves, sometimes costing up to $4 billion US, not million, billion. And the Russian population has viewed that about 40 million times, not just in Russia, but around the world. So what Mr. Putin has done is made sure that there was a way to neutralize Mr. Navalny. So August 2020, Mr. Navalny was poisoned by a chemical nerve agent called Novichok. They applied the nerve agent on the fly of his underpants, believe it or not. Mr. Navalny, heading back to Moscow from the city of Tomsk, became violently ill on the airplane. And so the pilot diverted the plane to Omsk, landed the plane despite the fact that the tower did not give him a landing permission. The pilot just violated the order, landed the plane anyway. The ambulance that was called in with a doctor aboard the ambulance suspected poisoning and actually had a chance to administer an antidote, which eventually saved Mr. Navalny's life. The prison treated him, and with international pressure, Mr. Navalny's wife managed to fly him out to Germany on a medevac airplane, where he was treated, where the nerve agent Novichok was identified from blood samples, and where Mr. Navalny recuperated for several months. Germany, as did many other European countries and also the United States, of course, condemned the poisoning attempt. The Kremlin, Mr. Putin, everybody has denied any involvement. As a matter of fact, they explain Mr. Navalny's poisoning with what they call a fact, that the poison was actually administered to Mr. Navalny while he spent time in a German hospital. So I think that is a rather interesting story. But Mr. Navalny from Germany pulled off a sensational stunt. The Bellingcat agency in England had actually identified the whole team of assassins of the FSB, the successor organization of the KGB, that was following Mr. Navalny around Russia, and it was believed that they had administered the poison to him. So Navalny managed to find the phone number for one of these people and called and pretended he was a right hand of the current FSB chief, and he would like to know what went wrong with the assassination. And the person on the other line got so intimidated that he started explaining why it went wrong. And the reason why it went wrong is because the flight was interrupted by the pilot that decided to land in Omsk. And if they would have continued the flight, he said Navalny surely would have passed away. So that was taped. It also went on YouTube. It also became viral, but it gives you a little bit of background and credibility why the West, including me, think that there was the FSB and thus the Russian Federation involved in that poisoning, which makes it an attempted extrajudicial killing. Continue. In 2021, January, Mr. Navalny decided to return to Russia. Now, why did he return to Russia? Navalny did not want to suffer the fate of many other opposition members in exile to become sort of irrelevant. And he knew if he does not go back to Russia, the Russian people would not necessarily be as supportive as they were before. That when I say Russian people, you have to understand many people that he will go and see demonstrate in Russia do not necessarily demonstrate because for Mr. Navalny or because Mr. Navalny organized the protests, but they actually, any Russian you will ask might have another alternative reason for going on the street. But to sum it up, people are simply sick and tired of the Putin regime. Having said that, what is also true, there is not tens of millions of people turning out into the street. There's literally tens and maybe 100,000 turning out, because a great part of the Russian population is just apolitical. They basically gave up. It pretty much describes the situation among the people like it was under Brezhnev before Gorbachev came along and tried to change things. Mr. Navalny was, of course, arrested at the airport. He was charged in what I would call a show trial in front of running cameras with violations of probation concerning a case where he and his brother were convicted, I believe it was 2013, defrauding some commercial company they have been consulting for. The European Court of Human Rights, this goes for Mr. Navalny, had actually declared that judgment, I think it was 3.5 years or so, void. And the reason for declaring it void was because it was used to keep Mr. Navalny from running for the presidential elections at that time. The Russians, of course, saw that differently, so they sent him to a prison colony. In the prison, just recently, 2-3 weeks ago, he developed severe problems with one of his legs, which more or less is paralyzed. So he's now depending on a wheelchair. No one knows what the cause of the problem is. Is it effects from his poisoning with Novichok, which can have long-term effects on the person's health, or is it something to do with a spinal injury? In any case, he was not doing very well. Now, as of today, he's in infirmary. Infirmary in a Russian prison does not mean that there's a doctor on call. It just means that there's a nurse and he's just being parked in another room. To top things off, in his unit, there is a sleeping area that houses more than 20 people. Tuberculosis has broken out. So Mr. Navalny is now suffering, on top of everything else, from a respiratory sickness. Tuberculosis is not untypical for Russian prisons, but in this case, I think it's a little bit too much of a coincidence that that type of sickness would break out when he is present. In any case, the prison refuses that Mr. Navalny can see his own doctors. They refuse to bring him to a local hospital, which could possibly treat him better than in the infirmary with a particular nurse there. So it is not unreasonable to think that Mr. Navalny dying from natural causes might benefit the Kremlin and thus Mr. Putin. In my mind, there is no doubt that Mr. Putin wants to neutralize Mr. Navalny. Whether that has to do with killing him or just disabling him, I don't know, but it's something that is not out of the realm of possibility. Extrajudicial killings of opponents, critics, and journalists have always happened since Russia has lost control over the other 14 republics when the USSR imploded after 1991. Before President Putin, it was mainly organized by the mob, not per se the state. And another big difference was no one ever touched the defectors from the Soviet or Russian intelligence services, as happened with people in England, for example. Putin changed the equation. There is no ideology at play when it comes to his politics. It's all about money. And that brings us back to the element of organized crime. In principle, in Russia, there is no organized crime as far as private activity is concerned. Mainly, organized crime now is being implemented by members of the government or members of the administration, including the intelligence services and the police services. So, in a way, criminality now is institutionalized and became an integral part of the state. And why is that? One author brought it to the point. He says, corruption is the new communism. That's the new ideology, if there is one. Russia has returned to the darkest days of its history, recent history. The services arrest Russians in their homes in the middle of the night. That is, if you go demonstrate, they don't bother arresting you there. They have enough video materials to identify you and then pick you up at home at a later point of time in the middle of the night. There are show trials. There are thousands of people arbitrarily incarcerated and sentenced to years in gulags over charges that appear completely engineered and left to kangaroo courts. There are numerous Russian citizens who, just like the great Andrei Sakharov, are currently locked away in mental institutions to isolate them from any activity. We have seen elements of what Joseph Stalin used to do to people, even though I would call that Stalin light until day, but it's not very encouraging for any expectations of better observation of human rights or even basic rights in a normal democracy. The world is watching what will happen to Mr. Navalny, but right now, Mr. Putin is preparing the next round in the conflict in Ukraine, an independent state that dares to seek a future with the West. When that next conflict breaks out, Navalny will become insignificant, so Mr. Putin hopes, it seems. The West must make it impossible for Mr. Putin's kleptocracy to use its loot and to reinvest into our economies. That has been a continued problem with the corruption. That money is not being kept at home. It's actually being infused into our own economies. And that brings exactly the problems that hit us here. And may I suggest, instead of just isolating Russia politically, which already has been done to a certain extent, it would be much more important to curb their economic activities. And one such step could, for example, be to take them out of the SWIFT payment system, which, by the way, is not a state institution, it's actually a private company. But in any case, most important for anyone in Russia and also outside is that Mr. Navalny will live, and I hope he will. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. It truly shows the biography and the life of Mr. Navalny and where he's at today. And I believe that Dr. White has a response, perhaps to clearly understand what the situation is in Russia right now. Dr. White.
Thank you, Baldomero. Thank you, Franz. That was an excellent introduction and summary. And I'm just going to really, as kind of a response, hit some of the high points along the way for people who may not have quite a solid understanding of Russia, to try and fill in some spaces and then maybe lead us to a point where we can have a bit of a conversation. As Franz notes, Navalny becomes a figure, more of a public figure around 2011, 2012. This is the period when we have what's often called as Putin fatigue. This was the moment when Putin made it clear that he would be returning once again, or at least running for the presidency, that he and Dmitry Medvedev would change positions, which is often called a castling move. And so the original protest started in 2011 about parliamentary elections, but then they continued all the way through to the third term inauguration of Putin. And this is where Navalny really kind of appears. He originally appears as a blogger, and this is something that Putin still continues to often call him. He will not recognize him as a politician or anything really else. He tries to minimize Navalny's influence by calling him a blogger. Navalny, on his part, though, is very smart because he is against corruption. He's anti-corruption. He's not anti-Putin, right? He's anti-corruption, and that's an important move on his part because it allows him to avoid being a direct, up until now, conflict with Putin, at least semantically. This is why it's ironic then that the Putin government would charge him with embezzlement, right? Because it's a kind of a response. Oh, you're an anti-corruption person? Well, look, you've been convicted of embezzlement, which also conveniently keeps him out of politics because once you've been convicted of embezzlement, you can't theoretically run for president. Of course, as Franz noted, the two big videos or YouTube sensations that you might want to look up if you're interested. First one was called He Is Not Demon to You. which was an explanation of Dmitry Medvedev, who was president at the time, his massive wealth. And the explanation or the issue of that video is, how does someone who's had a set kind of civil servant salary for all these years, how does he live like a multi-billionaire? Putin's palace is the most recent one, and it chronicles a lot of the same kind of things that are actually identified in Karen Dawisha's book about Putin's kleptocracy. If any of you want to kind of look for a US source, if you will, academic source, Karen Dawisha's book more or less parallels what Navalny then presents on his latest YouTube video. Poisoning is not new. I think we all know that, but just to underline that, there's a long list, but if we look at Alexander Vinenko, who was a former FSB agent, he was poisoned in London with plutonium, and it's pretty clear that it was on Russian Secret Service that did this. More recently is the Skripals. The Skripal had been a double agent and had been living in London since there was a prisoner exchange. He and his daughter were found in a park poisoned. And then even if we're moving away from poisoning, we can look at the death of Boris Nemtsov, who was also a liberal politician. He was shot on a bridge, and many believe for his political activities also around Ukrainian politics and also corruption. Obviously, one of the points of interest where we get convergence on Putin and Navalny, and then of course the Russian people, is around this idea, and Putin just signed it yesterday, which is an amendment to the Constitution, or changes to the Constitution, that would allow Putin to go for another 2 years, run for presidency twice more. In Russia, the presidency now is a 6-year term. So this would take him from 2024 to 2036, when he would be 85 years old. Not that there's anything with his age, but the point is by that point, he would have been the longest reigning politician, if you want to call him politician. We're already, beyond Stalin, and we might be looking at monarchy times at this point. The question really with Navalny recently is what changed in the equation, right? For a very long time, Putin and the Kremlin have been willing to allow Navalny to be on parole, quote unquote. They have not thought that he should be in prison, and clearly that has changed recently. And so that's maybe up for discussion that we can talk about today. The other side of it is Navalny a kind of a US phenomenon, right? We often in the US, because of our fraught relationship with Russia, we are often looking for the successor to Putin. And sometimes we in the United States are looking a little bit more for that successor than the Russians may be themselves. I can tell you from my own friends in Russia, there is some consternation. They don't really know who Navalny is. There's some worry that maybe he is backed by the CIA. Russia, as many of you probably know, has this, certainly the Kremlin has this concentration on foreign agents. There's been a lot of laws passed recently that limit, interaction with foreign agents. One article in Argumenty и Fakti made a really funny joke that you can feed feral cats, homeless cats, right? But you can't advocate for feral cats, and you certainly can't take money from the Humane Society to feed the cats, because one of those is a political action, advocating for feral cats, and the other one is taking money from a foreign agent, right? The Humane Society. And so this is kind of where we're at. And so it's a bit difficult for the United States to come out strongly in favor of Navalny, because already that almost kind of balances or upsets then this equation of, is Navalny a CIA agent or following foreign agents? I'll end with this very quickly. There was an interesting piece published in the Carnegie Moscow Center by Andrei Kolesnikov, who was working with survey data from Levada, which is Levada is the organization in Russia that does a lot of really interesting polling and data that way. And what this article found is that there's a split between a younger generation and an older generation, and they're almost mirror opposites of each other. So if you're 18 to 24, about 50% of you, 57% of you want another president after 2024. You don't want Putin to continue. Whereas if you're 55 or above, 59% of those folks do want Putin to continue. Similarly, then, if we move to the question of Navalny, again, the numbers are skewed based on age. So 18 to 24-year-olds, 36% of them approve of Navalny's actions, while only 12% of people 55 or over. Similarly, Navalny's poisoning by younger people was in fact 37% saw it as an attempt for Putin and the Kremlin to get rid of a political opponent, where only 9% of those 55 and above do that, or see that. Finally, then, the question is okay, so if we wait long enough, will this younger generation maybe, support Navalny and help overturn the Putin government? And Kolesnikov had a very interesting response to that. He says that if you think about it, it'll be a while before those young people become really politically active. In that period, then, most of them have to find jobs, most of them have to find their way into Russian society, and unfortunately, much of the Russian economy is still dominated by the state. And so the state, according to Kolesnikov, is going to slowly ask these young people to move much more towards conformism and some kind of loyalty to the state or to Putin. And so actually what the data is telling us is that material wealth for your average Russian is much more important than some concept of democracy or freedom. And so unfortunately, as much as the United States may want to see a successor to Putin in Navalny, I'm not sure that the Russians themselves necessarily see that.
Thank you, Fred. At this time, we'll be more than welcome to welcome questions from those individuals that are following the proceedings. Make sure you write those on the comment section on the Facebook. I'm going to ask a couple of questions if you folks don't mind, and perhaps either of you can answer them. If Navalny were to pass, which it appears that he doesn't have too many chances to continue to survive, sooner or later he will, would he become a martyr in Russia, or would it be another individual that, well, he tried, but perhaps, as you mentioned, Fred, the new generations are, quote unquote, afraid to raise their voice because who knows, they may be poisoned, or who knows, they may be A, B, and C. And therefore, according to the climate in Russia, let's keep quiet and move on. I was born during a dictatorship. And as a very young man, my parents taught me a principle. And the principle was, you see, you're here, but you keep your mouth shut. That was the common frame of my family teaching me how to be able to survive under the ruling of Franco, a dictator. Is the same thing or same environment occurring in Russia? Again, would it be a martyr, or would it be just, oh, another one, let's flip the chapter of our history?
Well, it is fair to say that in Russia, people, even martyrs, stay always in the memory. The Russians are just that way, and they're also a little bit melancholic that way. As goes for Mr. Navalny, in principle, and that is what is the shocking part for me, the chances for regime change in Russia through Mr. Navalny or Mr. Navalny replacing President Putin are basically zero. And the reason is exactly what Fred just said, and that is most people are not political. They don't like the regime that is now running the country. They don't like the crime, they don't like the corruption, but they still remember the old days. I'm talking Stalin. I'm talking millions of people being subjected to arrest in gulags and death and suffering. These memories are still very, very much alive. The divide between people pro-Putin, against Putin, pro-Navalny, against Navalny makes perfect sense to me, because you're talking a generation of older people that actually they're watching television, they're listening to radio, state-controlled institutions, whereas the younger people take their gospel from social media, much like in the United States in a way. So anyone hoping for a real regime change without literally millions filling the streets, it's not going to happen. I don't see it happening. It's very much along the lines with what you said, Baldemaro, as was under Franco, and what was under Franco was under Stalin, was under Hitler. So that is not untypical. There has to be another influence to play.
Yes, Baldemaro, you raised questions that often take about a week or so in my course on Putin to explain. So I'm going to try to condense entire weeks into a coherent response. First of all, the Russians do have a stronger sense around martyrs. It goes all the way back to Boris and Gleb, when before the Russian state even existed, there were all these Slavic little fiefdoms that were run by all these brothers and cousins. And the story of Boris and Gleb is that they knew that their brother Sviatopolk was going to come, and he was going to take their land, and he was going to execute them. And rather than running away or trying to avoid him or arming themselves, they accepted, right, the martyrdom. They allowed Sviatopolk to kill them. And Boris and Gleb, right, becomes like kind of these two iconic figures. This then idea grows in Russian Orthodoxy in a way that we don't find it in, say, Catholicism and some other religions, which is this idea of the suffering of Christ. The suffering of Christ becomes really essential. And eventually what happens is the church develops this idea that we now refer to as the Messianic Mission. And the Messianic Mission is this idea that the Slavic people have suffered over time and have taken on suffering, right, for the rest of the world, to kind of purify the rest of the world. And so they look to things like the invasion of Napoleon, or they look at even Nazi invasion of Hitler, right, or the Tartar-Mongol yoke, which came much earlier, 1200 to 1400, as instances where they suffered, right, for the collective good of the world. And so, yes, there is this kind of much more cultural attraction to martyrdom than you would say find in other cultures. And so certainly Navalny, if he plays into that line of cultural discourse, right, becoming a martyr is not necessarily a bad thing in the Russian context. To another question you asked, though, it's this question of when does authoritarianism flip over to totalitarianism? And I think we're right at that moment with Putin. I often describe authoritarianism as, if you're willing to allow the government to more or less do what it wants, it will allow you to do what you want. So you can go to the grocery store, you can buy magazines, you can read things, you can go take a vacation in Spain or Turkey. And as long as you're not interfering with the government, if you're not trying to organize protests or anything like that, you're fine. And for the longest time, this is where the Russians were. They were fine with authoritarianism because as long as they didn't challenge Putin directly, right, they lived okay. The problem, though, is with people like Navalny who are using the internet, right, we're now seeing the Russian government need to start to curtail those kind of activities. And it's funny because in 2013, 2014, when I was in Russia teaching as a Fulbright scholar, I would ask my students these kind of questions, like, is it okay that there's shutting down this magazine? Yeah, that's fine. Is it okay that they're, curtailing politicians? Yeah, that's fine. But when I got to, is it okay if they cut off your internet access? That's when their heads exploded, right? This is that younger generation. And totalitarianism is when we flip to that moment where your daily life is being negatively, or maybe positively negatively, but negatively impacted by the government. And we're now at that point. When Putin starts limiting the speed of internet, when he starts shutting off internet to certain areas, these kind of things start to have a day-to-day impact on people. So Navalny is connected with this discussion of, are we switching from authoritarian to totalitarianism? And then, going back to what Franz has been talking about, what's the stomach to change that? And are they willing to tear the whole system down? Because you don't suddenly go from totalitarianism, right, back to authoritarianism to something else, right?
Correct.
And let me just infuse one little thing, and that is, one thing has changed. Fred was spot on when he described the little liberties left to people, per se. And that is that the Kremlin has changed their stance to demonstrations, people coming out to voice their discontent. It used to be when you were not involved in participating in demonstrations, you were just walking the street, the police would not interfere with you. That has changed since about a year. That was sort of one of these unwritten laws. They will go after anyone who they will find, very much like what you saw in Belarus in recent days. Anyway, just wanted to say that.
Wow, interesting. Thank you very much for your comments. We have an individual, McKay Molestan, that's asking a question. If Navalny passes, would the movement die out, or would someone rise to take his place? Is the anti-corruption movement that strong at this point?
Well, so here's a bit of the problem, and Franz talked to this. Originally, there wasn't, people weren't coalescing around Navalny, at least in the beginning. It used to be that Navalny's kind of position was anybody but Putin, right? He would literally, that was kind of his, you don't have to vote for me, right? You don't have to vote for any party that I'm supporting, but just don't vote for Putin, right? And the reason for that was because there's a lot of anti-Putin factions, but there's been nobody around whom those anti-Putin factions could coalesce, right? Franz did note that now that he's in prison, right, it seems to be there's more cohesion around Navalny, but this is a new thing. And I think it would break up pretty easily. And I'll let Franz speak to that because I think he's got some good points on that. I would like to throw out though, with my own students, I often talk about Russian politics as being like a play, right? Everybody has a role to play, right? So we allow a communist party, we allow LDPR, which is the nationalist party in Zhirinovsky, we allow, a kind of a liberal left-leaning people that we trot out to talk to, American media and whatever. And as long as everybody continues to play those roles, right, it's worked for 20 years. The problem is when somebody steps beyond their role, right? And this is when we see somebody like Nemtsov, who was a liberal politician for 15 years before, suddenly is killed, right? And so the question is kind of back to McKay's original question is, if Navalny passes away in prison or somewhere else, does the Putin regime just replace him with another kind of, liberal, right, youngish, appealing person to play in this part, right? And does that person that the Putin administration and Kremlin would probably pick, is he or she able to then unite anti-Putin factions? And I doubt that that's the case, but I'm going to turn it over to Franz to discuss.
Well, I mean, if Navalny were to pass away in the circumstances in now, that would certainly mean that the activities of the opposition would be curbed for the time being. There is many other competent faces still inside Russia who could fill that role eventually. But of course, it would mean reorganizing, etc. And when you look at the opposition in Russia, I mean, you're not talking about 50% of the population. You're talking anywhere from 5 to 10% willing to go out there and do what they have to do. And many of them are just literally afraid of ending up in prison. I mean, imagine there's like 10,000 protesters serving longer time prison sentences just because they went out into the street. So they have also implemented new laws that qualify that type of offense. So that is one thing. The other thing is, when you look at the numbers as far as other opposition parties are concerned, the next in line next to Putin's party or Putin-friendly party would probably be the communists. And then there would be Zhirinovsky's party, which is a little bit of a right-wing nationalist type faction. And after that, there would be maybe Yabloko or someone with a very, very small percentage. And this is not because they manipulate the elections. That really reflects the Russian society. So what is happening now is Mr. Putin has, I think, understood that he cannot control people like Navalny. I mean, that will work for a certain time to sort of let him be on a long leash from his perspective. I'm saying this. But when things then go out of hand, they have a tendency to go out of hand really quickly. So besides arresting Mr. Navalny, trying to kill him, etc., trying to lock up as many people as possible, the Russians now have moved troops to the border with Ukraine, suggesting that about 120,000 troops and armored vehicles, etc., are in preparations to restart that conflict there. It sometimes happens when Mr. Putin feels that he has to change the narrative from being perceived as a bad politician to a more patriotic stance. Traditionally, whenever conflict broke out, the Russian people have a tendency to rally around the flag. So that is, we are all watching that. We are watching Mr. Navalny's health problems, and we are watching that with one eye. And the hope, obviously, is that Navalny, the man will go away. Stalin had a way of saying that: a man, a problem; no man, no problem. And I think that is pretty much where Mr. Putin stands today.
Yeah, and if we look at, sorry, Baldomero, really quickly, just to finish up on that, the last time that before January, the time previous when we saw protests at the scale and mass, it was around those 2011, 2012, 2013. And Putin put those down at Bolotnaya Square, right? Which was a massive protest that was put down rather violently. Now, the reason I bring that up is because the three kind of major figures that emerged from that were Boris Nemtsov, who is now dead, Alexei Navalny, who's now in prison, and Ksenia Sobchak. And Sobchak was subdued rather quickly by Putin because she was going to lose all of her access to her family's wealth, right? So the three kind of figures who last time led the protests against Putin are either incapacitated, dead, or no longer willing to go back into that. And there's nobody else. And this is the point. After 20 years of Putin, right, everyone has either been co-opted or eliminated or pushed to the side. And so this is why I ask my Russian friends all the time is there a way to move beyond Putin without blood, right? Because is there going to be a smooth transition of power? To whom? How? Right? What kind of form of government? It's a big question.
And don't forget that Putin has put together a Praetorian Guard that is 435,000 policemen, tanks and all, which is essentially an army. I mean, many nations don't have that many people under arms, and he's practically in control of what they call Rosguardia, which is uniformed police officers. And there's only one general under him, which of course is 100% loyalist. But he has done that because he sees the danger that his days could be numbered, and he tries to nip it in the bud that way.
Question, what about the international community? Are they responding to any of these concerns, or can they? I see it very complicated, but what is the EU or other players like the USA or thinking about? Yes, go ahead.
The Western countries are all doing business with Russia, period. As long as we do continue to do business with Russia, this will continue. This will keep Mr. Putin and his allies in power. If we do not cut them off economically, they only understand one language, and that is the availability or unavailability of money. If we do not cut them off from the money stream, this nightmare will continue.
Yeah, I mean, you look at how much natural gas and oil Russia supplies just to Europe, for example, right? And this always gives Angela Merkel and the rest of the EU, right, hesitation, because on one hand, they want to follow sanctions, right? Or exactly what Franz says, they've understood that doing selective sanctions on certain people is a much more effective way than punishing the Russian people en masse. But on the other hand, we don't want to go too deep on those sanctions because we need our gas and we need our oil, right? And so this is the dilemma that they have. Putin has been very clear about wanting to reestablish what he calls multipolar world, right? He looked at the period when the United States and EU were basically making decisions kind of unilaterally, you know, going into Afghanistan, going into Iraq, as problematic for the rest of the world. And he's been very clear since the Munich conference in 2007 that he would like to reestablish this almost Cold War dynamic, right? Where you have the US and EU wanting to do certain things, and you have maybe Russia, China, maybe India, in some kind of a relationship where there's enough power to say no, there's enough power to push back. This would stop NATO expansion. This would stop EU expansion into places like Ukraine, for example. And it really all comes down to, as Franz says, if we really boil it down, there's the historical part that Putin wants to look at, but then there's a lot of money, right, in this equation. And can Putin continue to make money and support Russia financially? And if he can, then he's going to do things like go into Syria and stand up al-Assad. He's going to continue to mess in Ukraine because historically he doesn't want Ukraine to go that way, both for historical reasons, but also for economic reasons. He'd like to pull them into his own Eurasian economic unit. So there's kind of this huge mix of historical factors, economic factors, you know, and this is all part of that kind of realpolitik that we're having to sort our way through right now.
Excellent.
And let me add one thing. Putting an individual or even a company on a sanctions list is not sufficient. It doesn't even begin to deal with the problem. It's, for me, it's signs of activities to show our people here in the West practically that they're doing something. But essentially, no one is willing to take on the elephant in the room, per se.
You know, Tanner Holmes asked the question, what would need to be done to organize a successful opposition against Putin?
Franz, you want to take that one?
Sure. You know, we know how things work. We used to have the Cold War. All we have to do is pick out our little history books, how we used to get things done. And one big lesson we have from those days is we got things done together in the West. And it's high time we return to a modus operandi where the Russians understand, and I'm not talking about the Russian population, I'm talking about Putin and the Kremlin and his kleptocrats, that we mean business. And if we do not do that, there is no way we're going to be able to influence anything.
I think one of the real difficult questions is I agree with Franz that, you know, there's kind of diplomacy issues and foreign policy issues, right? But I think if we're going to be really honest about the present state of Russia, and I've alluded to this already, is, you know, when Putin came to power, he established what was called the vertical of power, right? Which is a straight line up to him, more or less. And that made sense. When he took over in the 1990s, at the end of the 90s, beginning of 2000, everything was in a mess. You have regional governors who were doing whatever they wanted to do, right? He had to tighten that up. But by about 2009, 2010, that vertical of power was no longer really working for him. It was working against him. And the reason for that was everybody was beholden to either Putin directly or to United Russia, his party. And no one would make a decision. right? And we got this kind of moment where everything was starting to kind of freeze. This may in fact be the reason that Putin re-entered politics again as president, right? Because with Dmitry Medvedev at the top of the vertical power, people were not going to Medvedev and asking for answers like, can we do this or not? They still wanted Putin to say, even though he's prime minister, yes or no, right? So we've already seen that Putin trying to step out of a position of power is problematic for the system as it's presently built, and it's only gotten worse. And as Franz talks about, there's lots of money involved in the system, right? And so pulling Putin out of the top doesn't necessarily destroy the system, because there's going to be a lot of people who are invested in keeping, right, all of this kleptocracy or whatever you want to call it in place. Also, and I must say, this is also part of Kolesnikov's work with Levada, is most Russian people, like 45.9%, almost, nearly 50%, are happy with Putin until they can find another strong, and in the Russian concept, strong means kind of authoritarian, totalitarian leader. So even when we get rid of Putin, or when Putin moves on, or when he retires or whatever, it's very possible that we're going to have Putin 2.0. And so, this idea that somehow Russia is going to suddenly become democratic and, look like European nations that, prospered under the Marshall Plan, that's probably not going to happen, right? And I think we have to be honest about that.
And not to forget, we had a regime change in the sense that Putin replaced all his old friends and colleagues with young technocrats that he has trained.
We have time for just one more question. It is evident that the Russian Federation, especially the Putin, I don't want to say regime, but it is, they are in conflict of violation of human rights, especially now when we deal with poisoning activists or political leaders and so forth. And there's quite a bit of corruption, as we all know. Has the United Nations weighed in on this situation with Russia? I know that Russia is a member of the Security Council, has the strongest votes there. But what is being said around the UN circles in regards to this issue? Do we know?
I would call it lip service, to say something which really doesn't give the whole thing much meaning or support. I think the United Nations have been pretty meaningless in that whole discussion so far. But Fred, you might know more than I do here.
Well, here's the rub. I always kind of take the let's be realistic about where we're at, right? After 2006, Russia had paid off all of its international debt. So it had become a sovereign nation as of 2006. It also has, as you noted, Baldomero, the vote in the UN, so that's very powerful. It was also at the time one of the BRICS countries. You remember that fastest growing economies: Brazil, Russia, right, India, China, South Africa. And what all of those BRICS countries were kind of interested in was avoiding this kind of US-EU control, right? They were all trying to find a way around it. And it's around then the point with the protests in 2011, 2013, that Putin does what we call the Putin Pivot, meaning that he realized that these younger technocrats who are now protesting in the streets were no longer going to support him. And he made a radical change, and he became more conservative, more nationalistic, more orthodox. And he took on loosely the theories of this rather extreme thinker in Russia named Alexander Dugin, and Dugin's concept of the Russian world. And the basic concept of the Russian world is that Russia has never done well. When it's coming in contact with the West, it's always been a point of conflict. And rather than Russia becoming more like the West, more European, they've actually decided, they've pulled away and decided, what do we have to improve in our own society so that we can defend our next contact with the West? And so at this point, I don't think that Putin cares what the UN or what any of NATO or any of these organizations have to say. They can shake their finger at him as much as they want. He's economically sound and independent, despite the fact that the sanctions have hurt him. And he's embraced a whole different voting population now who doesn't want to be Western looking. right? They're happy to be Eurasians or Slavs or however they wanted to define that. So at this point, the outside world has very little, I think, influence on the day-to-day activities of Putin within Russia.
That's great. Any final words, Franz?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed the discussion. Very insightful to speak with you, Fred. Thank you very much, Sedelmayer.
That is great. Any final say, Fred?
I just think that, Russia is a country that keeps giving us lots of interesting questions to look at and to hopefully try to answer. And so, we've got a thriving Russian program at UVU. We're aligned with our National Security Studies program and other areas within the university. So I invite anybody who's interested in these kind of topics to revisit us at UVU whenever you can.
Thank you, gentlemen. It has been a great honor to be with you this morning or afternoon, not in Tennessee, not even in Pennsylvania, but in Virginia. Sorry, my apologies. But we look forward to continue having these discussions. I believe that it is needed. I think our community needs to be well aware. We will be extending an invitation to Mr. Sedelmayer to return back to UVU, hopefully next academic year, so you can continue to enlighten us. And again, thank you, gentlemen, for your insights, for your knowledge, for your experience, and your passion, which I totally love. For the rest of you that are following these proceedings, well, you know that this panel has been recorded both via Facebook as well as YouTube, and you'll be able to find with the rest of all your our activities, and in our YouTube, UVU Office for Global Engagement channel, you'll be able to see these proceedings as well as many others. Again, we thank you on behalf of the Office for Global Engagement. Thank you, Franz, honestly, for taking the time to be with us, and as well with you. Have a wonderful day, and thank you everyone for following this proceeding. Thank you very much.